Welcome back to Logo Legends, the podcast on sports teams and their identities, logos, and branding throughout history. My name is Kasabe. Welcome back from the winter break. We have new episodes every Thursday on my personal YouTube channel with visualizations, and we're also on Apple and Spotify. As we begin 2023, I wanted to shift the episodes more into a team history type of format. So what better way to start the new year than to go over the history of one of the newest teams added to the North American pro sports franchises, and that is the Seattle Kraken. We've seen talks over expansions for some pro sports teams over the last few decades or so, but the NHL is really the only one that's done so. They've gone up from 30 teams to 32. A lot of expansion over the early 2000s, late 90s, and they also added the Vegas Golden Knights in 2017 and now the Seattle Kraken in 2020. Now each conference has 16 teams to compete against each other. So a lot of speculation was that the Seattle area would get an NBA franchise to come back after the Sonics relocated to Oklahoma City, became the Thunder, but Seattle is very much a hockey town. They haven't really had that modern hockey team that you'd see in a professional sports league like the NHL since last century, like early last century. But there are a lot of passionate hockey fans in the city of Seattle. They've had a lot of battles trying to get in an NHL expansion franchise since the 70s. It's not like the Seattle Supersonics leaving kind of caused them to go harder for an NHL team. I mean, it might have a little bit, but they've always been trying to work and get an NHL team since at least the 70s. When the NHL granted some expansion teams back in 1974, they gave the first rights to Denver and Seattle, and they were both each slated to begin a couple seasons later in 1976, give them some ample time to kind of prepare, get some rosters together, things like that. But both cities would have their bids canceled, and the expansion was left in the dust for 1976. In Seattle's case, it was due to missed payment deadlines. In the 90s, there would be another bid for Seattle, which was again canceled due to financial differences, and those expansion franchises ended up going to Tampa Bay and Ottawa. And then most recently, there was some turmoil in Arizona. They've been trying to find a new city, a new stadium for quite some time. There's just been a lot of hopping around over the last 10 years, maybe like 15 years. So in 2013, Phoenix was speculated to relocate to a new city, and Seattle was at the top of that list, but the Coyotes were able to hash out a new deal with the city of Glendale, and they've stayed in Arizona ever since. This year, though, they're playing in a college stadium for the Arizona Sun Devils, so it's not an ideal situation. So I mentioned Seattle's always been a good hockey town, and part of that comes from a couple different franchises. So their most notable professional hockey team was the Seattle Metropolitans, which were actually the first American team to win the Stanley Cup back in 1917. This was before the NHL was fully formed, but again, the first American team to win the Stanley Cup. Prior to that, a lot of Canadian teams were winning. But eventually the Metropolitans folded in 1924, so it's been a good long time since Seattle's had a pro NHL caliber hockey team in their town. Some other notable teams included the Seattle Totems, which played from the 40s up until about 1975. And the Seattle Thunderbirds, who to this day currently play in the Western Hockey League. So that was kind of Seattle's hockey fix for the longest time, was the Thunderbirds. They have some of the best attendance in the Western Hockey League, even now today. So after the Golden Knights were awarded the 31st franchise back in 2016, fans knew it was only a matter of time before there would be a 32nd team to follow. You typically don't have an odd number of teams per conference, so 32nd team would make a whole lot of sense, and there was a lot of discussion over what city or what place would get the expansion franchise. So there were some initial memorandums passed in 2017 by the Seattle City Council because there were some minimum requirements that needed to be met in order for the NHL to select Seattle as one of those potential cities. They had some kind of behind-the-scenes work that they had to do. So the city was in position to throw their hat into the ring by having those requirements met. And back in March of 2018, there was a season ticket drive that was created to kind of just gauge the interest of the local area. So a lot of Seattle fans would have a chance to say, like, I'm interested, I want to put some money down, I want to get some season tickets if this does happen. And back when they announced this, they got 10,000 deposits in the first 12 minutes of it being live. So just for a little bit of context, when Las Vegas applied for their application and they started doing season ticket deposits, they only got about half of that. They got about 5,000 applicants in 2 days. Again, Seattle got 10,000 in 12 minutes, and they ended up getting 25,000 over the next hour. So with all the fan interest, the deal was approved in December of 2018, and obviously NHL was very happy to go to Seattle with that fan response. They wanted to try and start in 2020, but that was pushed back, and not due to the pandemic. It was just some T's that needed to be crossed, I's that needed to be dotted with the arena. They were just kind of like getting it ready. So their first official season was the 2021-2022 season, and with that, they were able to effectively start tuning their roster back in August of 2021. But once the deal was confirmed in 2018, there was a bit of a rush to kind of get the new team name, identity, logos to the forefront. So there were some thoughts to have the Metropolitans fill in as the team name, since you originally had the Seattle franchise back in the early 1900s. But there was some pushback from the NHL since they have the Metropolitan Conference, which still exists to this day in the Eastern Conference. In the process of building the new offices and kind of getting all of that stuff set up, they had some logos that were emblazoned on the side of the building that just said NHL Seattle, because you needed something to kind of say like, hey, we're coming to Seattle. We don't quite have an identity yet, but like here's some cool graphics in the meantime. And one morning there was a handwritten note via Post-it that was stuck to the door. And on the note, it said, "Release the Kraken." So the phrase "release the Kraken's" been in the public nomenclature for, I would say, about 40 years. It was first used in the 1981 film The Clash of the Titans, which they had a remake in 2010, featuring Liam Neeson, extremely memeable line that people kind of took and ran with for quite some time. But the legend of the Kraken and just some other like octopi that you can kind of find on the Pacific Coast, that's something that's very unique to the Seattle area, and in terms of team nicknames, isn't something that's very common. According to the Seattle ownership team, they acknowledged over 1,200 potential team nicknames, narrowed it down to about 100, and then finally about 5, which those 5 nicknames are set inside a time capsule, and they actually placed that time capsule at the Seattle Space Needle to be opened in 2062, which is the 100-year anniversary of the building of the Space Needle. But ownership had a close eye on public reception. They did a ton of analytics and just kind of like shadow watching on Twitter to see like what fans liked, what kind of feedback they had for certain names. So the name Kraken was effectively selected at the end of 2019. The 2 closest nicknames that we know to this day are the Seattle Sockeyes, which is a type of fish, and a callback to the Seattle Totems. The Totems was also a kind of popular one. So from there, once the name Kraken was picked, they tried to hide the trademarks as long as possible, keep it kind of a good reveal for when they chose to. But they needed to pick the logo and the colors, and the city of Seattle often identifies itself in shades of blue and green. Really, the only team that didn't fit into that is the Sonics, which no longer exist, but you have the Seattle Seahawks and the Seattle Mariners, which both use a blue and green or blue and teal type of color. Even the Thunderbirds in the Western Hockey League, they have a blue and green that they also use. So this is a very true color scheme to the city. Like think Pittsburgh, you have black and yellow. Seattle's very blue and green. However, they wanted to tweak the colors just enough to kind of stand out from the rest of the pro franchises and kind of carve out a bit more of their own unique identity. So they landed on a blue that they called Deep Sea. It's like a very blue, almost black type of navy. And they had a greenish blue, kind of like turquoise aqua secondary. The last step was adding a pinch of mystery, which ended up being a red accent that they added to the uniforms and a eye to the Kraken on the logo. The color itself was fittingly named Red Alert. So looking at the logo, there's just so many cool parts about this design, and ownership wanted something intimidating. They didn't want something that was very soft, and they wanted an image that was to be taken seriously right off the bat. I mean, this is an expansion team where their roster is not going to be very good, and you're probably not going to have some winning ways for a while, so you don't want to be looked down upon as a franchise. To their credit, the Kraken played very well in their first year in the NHL. The Golden Knights also did very well for their first few seasons. So their idea was to form an S for Seattle into the shape of a sea monster, and it kind of looks like both a monster and a kind of flexing tentacle at the same time. However, if you look at the inside of the tentacle where there's like a fold in the middle, there's actually a more natural looking tentacle in the negative space into the blue. They also have a red eye at the top of the design, which kind of looks like the eye of a sea monster. It's very mysterious, intimidating, just subtle enough where it gives it a bit of personality, but also kind of provides some of that mystery that the team was looking for. It's just enough red to make a good point, too. So if you've seen the original Metropolitans uniforms from 100 years ago, they were very red and green with some horizontal stripes. And if you think the Minnesota Wild had some Christmas-looking uniforms, I mean, this one takes the fruitcake, absolutely. I also think the Kraken have one of the best secondary or alternate logos in the league, if not all of sports. There is an anchor that forms into the Space Needle at the top of the design. It's just super cool. So that just about does it for the Kraken and their logo history, but before I end the episode, I just wanted to share one other anecdote that kind of came along with the Seattle Kraken, their nicknames, and also the logos as they were kind of going through that vetting process. And that is a nickname idea that the internet came up with, namely on Reddit. So again, back when there was speculation on what the Seattle team nickname might be, there was a thread on r/hockey where people were talking about their favorite ideas for what the team name could be. And they came up with an idea called the Rain City Bitch Pigeons, which the name comes from a joke relating to the Seattle Seahawks. A lot of teams just kind of have that moniker that people, opponents or foes of that franchise, just kind of called to degrade the team. So Seahawks, you call a bitch pigeon because a bitch pigeon isn't as intimidating as a Seahawk. So again, this kind of originated from a football subreddit, but the hockey subreddit took it, ran with it. It was kind of a funny moment for a while. And then a bit later, there was another thread where a user on Reddit made some team uniforms. They made a logo and a design for the bitch pigeons themselves. The username was Dalb Traps, and it was a pigeon in a yellow rain hat and jacket. So kind of made it like a scowling face, but overall, like the logo itself was very clean. The post itself got over 12,000 upvotes. It was universally acclaimed. Everybody from all different team fandoms liked it. And for those that were in Seattle, the only thing that really offended them about the logo itself wasn't the name. It was the fact that the pigeon had an umbrella in the background, which is not something that's used by the locals very often. That's something where you can kind of like peg the person using an umbrella as a tourist and not from around town. But in all seriousness though, I think the Kraken have one of the best logos, team names, and uniform kits in the NHL, if not all of sports right now. And just the team branding from top to bottom is an absolute win. But what are your thoughts on the Seattle Kraken? Is there anything that you like that we didn't cover in the episode, or do you think for some reason that there's a bit more of a negative response to the logos and design? Let me know on Twitter at kasabekompiles, that's Kasabe, and then compiles with a K, or you can leave me a comment if you're watching along on YouTube. So before wrapping up this episode, I wanted to mention some of the sources that I used for this video, namely from Emily Kaplan on ESPN. They did a very investigative and extensive report on the history of the Seattle Kraken, which was a huge story for the NHL. I mean, you don't get an expansion franchise every day. So a huge shout out to Emily Kaplan for their extensive coverage of the Seattle Kraken back when they were inaugurated. And thank you for listening to Logo Legends. Again, my name is Kasabe. We'll see you next Thursday. New episodes every week on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple. We'll see you next time.